Greetings, wanderers of the internet. Welcome to another argument analysis. And today we're gonna analyze Matt Slick's rendering of the Transcendental Argument for God, better known as TAG. And he begins by defining what he calls the logical absolutes: the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. I have no issue with the first two, but I would argue that his understanding of the law of the excluded middle is deficient. There is middle ground when we deal with gradation, in things like color, temperature, sensation, beauty, and other similar concepts. And in logic, we've developed ways to deal with gradation. So in classical logic, the law of the excluded middle is formulated as P or not P. Either P is true or not P is true. So under this system, if P equals 1, that is true, then not P must equal 0, that is false. And the other way around, if not P equals 1, then P equals 0. However, as I mentioned, this framework lacks expressive power. Specifically, it doesn't accommodate gradation. So in fuzzy logic, which is a non-classical logical system, the same proposition could be treated like this. Let's suppose that P equals 0.3, and this would imply that not P equals 0.7. So in fuzzy logic, truth values also range between 0 and 1, but with a lot of middle ground between them. So in this case, P would be barely true and not P mostly true. So we're still working within a binary structure of truth and falsity, but fuzzy logic allows for degrees between full truth and full falsity, 1 and 0. His second section is meant to present an argument, but it's not at all clear how the conclusion in 2.5 is inferred from the premises. It's also unclear how those premises illustrate his earlier claim that logical absolutes are truth statements. So instead, he seems to simply provide more examples of how the laws of identity and non-contradiction work, while restating at the same time his metaphysical view of identity, namely that something is identical to itself if it possesses the same attributes and nature. And there's more that could be said here, but since his argument is long, I won't dwell on this section for too long. So let's grant his conclusion in 2.5 for the sake of argument, that these three logical principles are objective and invariant. However, this claim is only partially correct, as I see it. Many things in the world exhibit gradation, as we already saw. And in formal terms, this is represented through fractional truth values. That is, truth values that fall between 1 completely true and 0 completely false. So this alone challenges the claim of full invariance. In certain cases, like pregnancy, the classical law of the excluded middle applies cleanly, but in other cases, such as degrees of color or warmth, it clearly does not. This partial failure carries over into other parts of Slick's tag. If we accept his absolutist reading of the three logical laws, then when he claims, for example, if the logical absolutes are not absolute, then truth cannot be known, the claim falls apart. As shown, gradation and the resulting context-sensitive application of the law of the excluded middle in no way blocks our ability to know things. And the same goes for his claim in 3.2. Gradation does not prevent us from engaging in rational discourse. Now, I can agree with Slick's more general point in section 3 that rationality would be impossible without an ordered way of thinking about an ordered reality. However, his deficient understanding of logic and the specific form of his argument render it, as I've shown, unsound, meaning it contains false premises. And I'm not even evaluating its validity yet, because the logical relationships between his premises are not clearly laid out. But that said, we can reconstruct the basic thrust of his argument more clearly as follows. Premise 1, if truth and rationality are possible, then logical absolutes must be in place. Second premise, truth and rationality are possible. Conclusion, therefore, logical absolutes must be in place. And this is the core of his view, his position. He also gestures towards reductio ad absurdum when he explores the consequences of denying the consequent in premise 1. And viewed in this way, I can now say that the argument is valid. However, it is unsound for the reasons I've already explained. Now, let's turn to section 4. And here, Slick claims that the laws of logic are independent of space, time, and human minds, and that this independence makes them transcendent. But what does Slick actually mean by independent? It seems to be just a restatement of invariance, that these laws do not vary from place to place, from time to time, or from person to person. So in other words, invariance is taken to imply independence. However, I think this claim is ultimately false, and let me explain why. First, we need to recall that Slick's claim about the logical absolutes is conjunctive. Identity and non-contradiction and excluded middle. And this means that whatever Slick asserts about logical absolutes, he asserts about all three together. So if we can show that his claims fail for even one of them, and we've already shown that his understanding of the excluded middle is deficient, then the entire conjunction fails. For example, he claims invariance for all three, but I've shown that the law of the excluded middle is variant. And in a conjunctive proposition, if even one conjunct is false, the whole statement is false, and therefore his overall claim about logical absolutes collapses. Second, because the excluded middle is variant, we should expect it to be dependent on certain conditions. And it is. Consider color again. It is a physical property based on how light reflects off surfaces. And this means that color perception depends on physical circumstances, and in these cases, the principle of the excluded middle does not hold cleanly. Thus, there are spatiotemporal contexts that don't accommodate the classical view of the excluded middle. So, if we symbolize his transcendence claim as Ti and TNC and TEM, and we've shown that TEM is false, then Ti and TNC and TEM is false. So if one falls, the entire claim of transcendence also falls with it. But I think we can go further in undermining Slick's claim. Even if we grant that the laws of identity and non-contradiction are invariant, that doesn't mean they are independent of space and time. Actually, I would argue that they are the way they are precisely because of the way reality is structured in space and time. In other words, identity and non-contradiction are mental laws contingent on the ordered nature of reality. Take the law of identity A equals A. This holds because, in reality, a thing is identical to itself only when all the components that make it what it is remain the same. Similarly, the law of non-contradiction, it's not the case that P and not P, is valid because if something is a certain way at a certain time, it cannot simultaneously be another way at the same time. And these principles reflect how things actually function in a spatio-temporal world. They are derived from and bound to the conditions of space-time. So if there were no space, no time, no spatio-temporally embedded entities, there would be nothing to be identical or contradictory. And in such a scenario, these logical laws would become meaningless. They would reappear only with the reappearance of space, time, and a structured reality. So now, these three logical principles are not transcendent. One of them, the excluded middle, varies under certain conditions, and the other two, though invariant, are still dependent on the existence of space and time for their applicability and intelligibility. And this has serious implications for Slick's fifth section, as we'll now examine. His claim in 5.2 is rhetorical, but his claims in 5.1 and 5.3 are simply false. As we've already discussed, the logical principles it refers to are contingent on space, time, and spatio-temporal reality. And this actually makes his implication in 5.3.1 correct. Yes, these logical principles would disappear along with the disappearance of space, time, and the structured entities within them. However, his claim in 5.3.2 is false. The mere existence of something does not imply that it can be measured. For example, we cannot measure the mind itself. We have psychometric tools to assess intelligence, empathy, personal traits, and other manifestations of the mind, but not the mind as such. And yes, our minds are themselves dependent on spatio-temporal conditions. They arise from and operate within a physical framework. And this also makes his claims in 5.4 false, for the same reasons we've covered in our discussion of section 4. So what started in sections 1 through 4 as an argument with some partially defensible elements, especially regarding identity and non-contradiction, by section 5 becomes completely unsound. So there's nothing left to salvage. Now in section 6, Slick runs into some serious tensions here. He wants to claim the logical absolutes are objective, invariant, and independent, but then he also describes them as conceptual, calling them a process of the mind. If they are truly a process of the mind and the mind is contingent on spatio-temporal conditions, then it follows that logical absolutes would also be contingent on those same conditions, possibly even more so than I suggested earlier. So before I argued that logical laws are contingent on space and time because they reflect how reality is structured and thus act as external laws that shape our thinking. But Slick's characterization of them as internal mental processes implies something else, namely that as our minds vary under different physical and psychological conditions, so too would logical absolutes. And this would make them just as variable as our emotions, our reasoning capacities, or our stress tolerance, and would differ from person to person. And that directly undermines his claim in 6.2, which must therefore be considered false. As we've seen, the errors in his argument continue to accumulate, and this makes Slick's position increasingly unsalvageable. But with that, let's move on to section 7. The opening claims in section 7 are largely irrelevant to the main point Slick is trying to make, which only begins to take shape around line 7.4. And yes, it's reasonable to say that a perfect mind would produce perfect thoughts. But in 7.5, it's unclear how the properties Slick attributes to logical absolutes, such as transcendence, absoluteness, invariance, and independence, are supposed to transfer to this so-called perfect mind. And where does this assumption of a perfect mind even come from? Why are we suddenly introducing this idea, and what justifies it? So, although Slick doesn't explain this clearly, we can assume he's trying to link it back to his earlier point about conceptuality. So if we reconstruct his intended line of reasoning more explicitly, it would look something like this. Logical absolutes are mental processes. Logical absolutes are absolute, transcendent, invariant, and independent. And from these premises, we can conclude that these are absolute, transcendent, invariant, and independent mental processes. Then human beings do not have absolute, transcendent, invariant, and independent mental processes. And from here we can infer that these mental processes are non-human. We can then add the hypothesis that there is only one personal being, God, who possesses these properties. And from here we can deduce that God is the only personal being who has these non-human mental processes. And this would be a valid argument, and it avoids some of the theoretical problems we discussed earlier, particularly the tension between logical absolutes being both conceptual and transcendent. At the very least, we can say that it's possible to reconstruct Slick's argument in a way that is internally consistent and valid. But based on the criticisms already presented, premise 2, as I see it, is false. Logical absolutes are not conjunctively absolute, transcendent, invariant, and independent. And without premise 2, we cannot infer 3. Without 3, we cannot infer 5. And without 5, we cannot get to 7. Slick then addresses some objections in section 8, which we'll skip it for now. So we move on to section 9. And this is where he employs the disjunctive syllogism I mentioned in another video. And here, to his credit, he actually does some of the necessary work. Looking at his tag as a whole, he offers a positive case for his position by attempting to ground logical absolutes in the mind of God. That is, he claims their transcendent reality is secured by being mental processes within God's mind. However, this raises new questions. How do these transcendent thought processes manifest in our non-transcendent minds? And if they reside in God's mind, what kind of mechanism allows them to structure human reasoning without transferring their transcendent nature into human cognition, since our minds are clearly not suitable hosts for transcendent mental processes? So this area is very underdeveloped, and I think it needs serious theoretical work. But that said, Slick does also provide a negative critique of several alternative worldviews. In section 8, we skipped it. And this is what enables him to reasonably conclude his own worldview through a disjunctive syllogism. Still, as we've seen, there are false premises and unresolved conceptual tensions that Slick fails to overcome, and these make his reconstructed argument, while valid, ultimately unsound. So let's summarize his reasoning as a whole. Step 1. Matt Slick's Christian worldview, or alternatives to Matt Slick's Christian worldview. Step 2. Prove his worldview by step 3. His argument for logical absolutes, their necessity. And step 4. His argument that these logical absolutes are in God's mind. Step 5. If step 3 and 4 are true, then God is the precondition for intelligibility. And with this, he passes a transcendental test. Step 6. Alternatives to Matt Slick's Christian worldview are false. and this is based on his critiques. So the alternative views fail at the transcendental tests. So step 7, it is not the case that alternative worldviews are true. And final step, step 8, Matt Slick's Christian worldview is the correct one. Therefore, God is the real precondition of intelligibility. Now, before I finish this video, there's just one final criticism I would like to make. Even if we consider that this macro argument is sound, it still doesn't establish the Trinity as the precondition for intelligibility. Because a Brahmanic Hindu, a Muslim, or even a generic philosophical theist, they could all adopt this version of tag to support their own form of monotheism. So this is an unresolved issue for Christian presuppositionalists. They need to customize tag in such a way that it leads directly to Christian theism specifically, Trinitarian theism, rather than merely a generic version of monotheism. So again, final verdict, valid but unsound.